Hi guys, I want to give you some information on organizing your APA paper. Obviously, every paper needs an introduction, body paragraphs, and a conclusion, but there's a lot more freedom, I think, with this paper than you have had, particularly with the MLA paper. So while I'm going to give you this lecture here on the structure of a paper with APA case study suggestions, I think you might get the impression that this isn't set in stone. It doesn't have to be like this. Again, you have a lot of freedom with how you want to structure your paper and how you want to organize it. I think that ultimately what's important to know is that I think a lot of the papers in the past have kind of just explained the case study as opposed to analyzed it, and then at the end made a bigger argument about social media. I think that that's, certainly there are papers out there that can do that effectively. I would say that if 80% of your paper is your case study, a paper like that probably can't score higher than a B minus or a C plus maybe. Just kind of like an average discussion of your case study with implications. What I'm really looking for is an analysis of your case study as it relates to your main social media claim. So with that being said, what I want you to try to do is to work in your argument about social media throughout your paper. That's ultimately the goal. The structure of a paper with APA case study suggestions, and again, this is sort of a loose guideline, and you can organize your paper and work through your paper in whatever way makes the most sense to the topic that you're writing. All right, so all papers, doesn't matter what, have to have an introduction. You'll begin with a hook sentence or an attention grabber. Some students will decide to start just right away talking about your case study. Some students will start to talk about social media in general. I think that there are pros and cons to each. The really big pro to talking about social media in general, somewhere in your hook sentence or your attention grabber, means that you are reminding your reader that really this paper isn't about your case study. It's about social media, and that's ultimately the goal and what I want you to remember. Starting with a case study can sometimes lead you astray, can make you feel like this paper is about the case study, when of course the case study is incorporated, but it's really just used to exemplify your argument about social media. So I feel like maybe my personal preference is for students to begin with a statement about social media in general, or if you have, if you're like, my case study will make for the perfect hook sentence or attention grabber, try to work in its relationship to social media. If you're picking a person, I think it's important that your attention grabber or hook sentence mention that person, but in relation to social media. Same with an event or some kind of meme, or a company or something like that. Once you've done your hook sentence, attention grabber, you want to provide background information. Make sure that you mention, again, social media in general or as it relates to your argument, and also your case study topic. So by the time I get to your thesis statement or even your first body paragraph, there should be no surprises that, one, and most importantly, this is an argumentative paper about social media. Making observations about social media or noticing certain things about social media. And then also there should be no surprises as to what your case study is. So somewhere, even if if you have let's say you have for example, a specific beauty blogger, you don't necessarily in your introduction have to name drop that beauty blogger, but maybe in your thesis you should, but in the background information, you should mention at the very least just like bloggers in general or beauty bloggers in general. And I think that would be an alternatively effective way to introduce your subject matter, or particularly what you're going to be analyzing, what is your case study. So I think that both of those things should be found somewhere in background information in that middle section of your introduction. Then, of course, the final sentence of your intro should be your thesis statement. again, the focal point of your thesis should be the argument that you're going to make about social media. I think that this is one of the hardest things that my students, again, have to do in terms of really making sure that their thesis is not about their case study, but their thesis is, here's the argument I'm making about social media, and this can be seen in insert case study here. Or the case study helps prove the idea that, and then whatever the argument about social media is going to be. So I think a very effective thesis will preface or will focus on the argument that you're going to make about social media, and it will also mention your case study. So I have a couple of examples here. I've highlighted in blue the argument, and then I've highlighted in yellow the case study. So A says, social media is a gateway for negative and hateful words as it brings out individuals' inner darkness due to its nature of users freely speaking their minds while hiding behind a computer screen. And this is especially evident in posts on Facebook regarding pit bulls. So again, really, I could easily delete the second part of the sentence that comes after that comma, after the phrase computer screen, and still have an argument. And then another example, B, you begin with a case study in this example as opposed to ending with it. So some people might like this structure better. By analyzing happy birthday posts on Facebook, it becomes clear that social media simultaneously creates and reveals individuals as inner narcissists due to its popular trend of life casting, particularly with millennial users. Okay, so again, happy birthday posts on Facebook, maybe even by millennial users is my case study, but I could take that out and I would still have an argument about social media. And I think that that's really the test for you. Once you write your thesis statement, what I want you to do is remove any mention of your case study and see if you still have an argument about social media. If you do, then your thesis is probably on the right track. If you don't, then you would need to revise your thesis statement because it's not an effective thesis statement for the goals of this paper. So some example thesis statements that would need revision because they focus too heavily on the case study, and these relate specifically to the ones that we just read, there are many posts on Facebook about pit bulls, and all people seem to do is use Facebook to argue about whether or not the breed is inherently aggressive or not. Okay, so here is, if I read a thesis statement like this in your paper, I would say, and what does this suggest about social media? Okay, so if I took out pit bulls, I would have to take out this phrase, there's many posts on Facebook about pit bulls that argue about whether or not the breed is inherently aggressive, and all I would really be left with is, all people seem to do is use Facebook to argue. That's like an observation that should lead to an argument about social media. So it's definitely something that could help you go into the right direction, but it's just not as effective as a thesis statement as I'm looking for. And then here's another example of a thesis that would need to be revised. Millennial users tend to life cast the most and tell their followers what they're doing, like wishing their friends happy birthday. That, again, wishing their friends happy birthday, really the case study here. What this statement is saying is that millennial users life cast, which is a fact. Life cast the most could be an argument, but that's about millennials and not about social media. So again, I would read this thesis, and in my evaluation process, I would write a comment for you saying something like, what does this suggest about social media? And then you could, of course, refer back to these two examples and see how this is the argument that I'm wanting to look for. Like, social media does something, social media is something, social media helps, hinders, argue about social media. All right, so that's the introduction. Now, in terms of body paragraphs, you have the same structure in your body paragraphs that you have used for writing any body paragraph. Begin with a topic sentence, use supporting details to argue for whatever you're saying in your topic sentence, and make sure that you wrap your paragraph up. Don't end on a quote, don't end on a paraphrase, don't end on a citation. You should use, your voice should be what begins and ends that paragraph with all the support in the middle. When you are looking at body paragraphs for this paper, there are a lot of options that you have to kind of work from regarding supporting details. You might have to give some context or sort of like what was happening surrounding your case study or surrounding a particular post from your case study, what led up to that post or event or comment or whatever. You can quote and paraphrase from primary and secondary sources. You would want to explain some quotes if they are confusing or convoluted. Of course, then you can also provide ideally some logical reasoning, analysis, things like that. So you guys are no stranger to the structure of a body paragraph, but what I also want to offer you here under this body paragraph segment is types of body paragraphs, particularly those for this type of paper that we're writing. And I think you have a lot of options. And I think that some of these papers you'll write might include all of them or almost all of them. Ideally, though, you really want to make sure that they're not all just type 1, which I'm labeling as informative. And again, this is the type of paper I usually see, is just a lot of information about the case study. And I don't think that ends up making for an effective paper. And certainly if your goal is to get higher than a B-, you want to make sure that you're not just providing informative paragraphs, but there is room in your paper for an informative paragraph. And I think that a paragraph like this would tell your reader what your case study is about in more detail than you do in your introduction. So a paragraph like this would probably come immediately after the introduction, and it would only be effective, again, if your introduction didn't really cover too many details. It just kind of maybe talked about social media, a little bit about your case study, but now you're giving a ton of information. There may be a few paragraphs in your paper that could be purely informative, and that would likely be all right. You might also decide that you want to write a concession paragraph, and this paragraph would be most effective if you have a controversial argument. Not necessarily if your topic is controversial, but if your argument about social media has maybe not necessarily controversy, but has multiple sides. So a concession paragraph is like acknowledging that there are alternate viewpoints or facets of your opponent's viewpoint that actually do have some merit. It's like saying, okay, you're right about this and this. I'll give you that. I'll concede to that. Here's my concession. Yes, you're right that social media is this and this. However, when we particularly look at this one case study, we also see that social media is, and then you can go on in further paragraphs to make your argument. So the effective thing about a concession paragraph is like, if you think that your reader already disagrees with you, providing a concession or conceding just a little bit helps to build trust. It helps to give your reader a sense of they understand my argument, or they're willing to have sort of like some kind of compromise while writing this paper. And so again, if you feel that you have room in your argument for a concession, not all papers are going to have room for this. So this is certainly, nothing in here is a requirement. But I think that if you do decide you want to have a concession paragraph, it might be most effective toward the beginning of your argument, maybe body paragraph 2 or something like that. If you're not going to have an informative paragraph about your case study, then maybe the first body paragraph. Again, that's why you might get the sense that there's a lot of freedom here, because I don't know what's going to be best for your paper and your argument and your claims and your case study. But concession paragraphs can be helpful. Alternatively, you can also provide an opposing argument paragraph, and a paragraph like this, instead of giving a concession, it's just saying, okay, this is the argument of those who disagree in some ways with what I am about to say or what I have said. These give you a platform to refute your opponents. You're not necessarily, in a paragraph like this, you're not necessarily providing any concessions. You're not saying, okay, I do agree with my opponent on these points, however, and then continue your argument later. You are just saying, the opponent believes this and this. So it's pretty informative, I guess, in its own right. And again, this would be really effective if you are saying something about social media that someone directly disagrees with. I think that's everything I want to say about opposing argument. I guess what I will also say is that if you find your opposing argument, you want to present an opposing argument, but you kind of do feel like there are a few things you can see or agree with, or a few things from the opposing argument that have merit, you could find a way to blend a concession and opposing argument paragraph together. And I think that would likely be effective and fine depending on the level of detail you're going to provide for both the opposing argument and the concession itself. The rest of like 4, 5, and 6 that you see here, the rest of these types of paragraphs are really, I think, what should maybe make up the majority of your paper. So the 3 we've just talked about, informative, concession, and opposing argument, depending on your paper, on your topic, on how you're spinning your argument, you might have 1 or 2 paragraphs from that. But then the rest of your paper ideally will be analytical, theoretical, or a mixture of both. So in an analytical or psychoanalytical paragraph, you're really just analyzing your social media. You're saying, okay, I see people posting this. Here's a specific example of a post. This is what I think it says about social media, and kind of like breaking down that logical reasoning. You get to tell your reader exactly what you're thinking about a post like the ones that you're seeing, or about a function of social media, or person, event, whatever it is on social media. And I think that these types of paragraphs are particularly effective if you have a lot to analyze, if you have a lot of posts that really are helping you build your argument, a lot of that primary source material. And number 5 is theoretical. And so you also might find that a paragraph just talking about other scholars' theories and using them, like applying someone else's scholarly theory about social media to your own argument and to your own claim and case study, might be really effective. Some people, depending on their case study, depending on their argument, are going to rely heavily on primary sources. Other people might rely heavily on secondary sources or a more theoretical approach to making your social media argument, and either one of those is perfectly fine. In the APA paper, you'll remember that I only ask that you have 10 sources, but it doesn't matter how many are primary and how many are secondary. Then of course there's my favorite type of paragraph, which is the analytical and theoretical, which is a mixture of 4 and 5. So first you would present your own analysis of social media, and then you would go on to grab those secondary sources or that theory of social media in order to back up your ideas. And I find that these paragraphs make the most supportive types. I have written an example paragraph so that you guys have access to something that is an example of what I consider really good writing for this paper. So this would be a body paragraph, and you can read through this. I've linked it in the FYI section in a standalone section, and also in these notes if you want. I would definitely encourage you to read it. So I give a topic sentence. I go for a couple of maybe like 3 or 4 sentences presenting social media, a primary source, and then I bring in some secondary support throughout. Probably 50% or more of the paragraph is secondary support, and then I try to tie that secondary support back in a concluding sentence. So I definitely encourage you guys to check that out. Finally, you have your conclusion. So you should do in this conclusion what you do in every other conclusion. Restate your thesis in a new way. Don't just copy and paste it from your introduction. And then answer the question, so what? Why does this matter? What's the most important takeaway for your reader? What is it, again, that you really want them to understand? Not about your case study, but about social media. Make sure that your conclusion focuses on social media. If you don't even mention your case study in your conclusion, that's actually just fine, because at this point you should be wrapping up. If you do mention your case study in your conclusion, also fine, but if you don't, that's that might be a good test to make sure that your paper has focused on social media in general. Okay, well, I think that this covers everything. These notes that you see through this video are linked in the FYI section for this week. So if you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, happy writing.